But for our purposes here, it's clear. One of the greatest postmodern philosophers is telling us that Thucydides represents a fundamental alternative to Plato. And in fact, Thucydides represents a cure, as Nietzsche says, for those people today who have been educated in a so-called classical education, which, according to Nietzsche, is misguided by the privileging of Plato and the Platonic tradition instead of Thucydides. And notice what he says further about Thucydides, that you have to turn him over line by line to understand what his ulterior motives are, as opposed to merely what his words are. Now, that's a very powerful claim, especially coming from a philologist like Nietzsche, who absolutely specialized in languages and words in particular. So he's telling us that we need to be on our guard and read very carefully, which is to say not casually, as we're reading Thucydides. Now further, what Nietzsche claims there is that Thucydides is the culmination of the non-decadent Greek instincts of the more ancient Hellenes or Greeks. It gets replaced and left behind by the decadence of what Nietzsche says is Greek philosophy. He's clearly talking about Plato and the Platonic tradition there. Now that means something very specific for Nietzsche, but for us in particular, what from all other peoples. That's going to be enormously important for us as we read through the opening paragraphs of Thucydides. And lastly, what I'll say is this. Nietzsche closes that passage by noting that what separates Thucydides from Plato or the Platonic tradition is some kind of self-control, or what we might think of as prudence. And it's precisely that self-control that gives one control. Another way to phrase that is that Nietzsche is telling us that a careful and meticulous reading of Thucydides provides us here and now with some kind of teaching of politics that is extremely relevant if it is the case that one seeks power. Now, there's an enormous amount more that can be said about all of that with regard to Nietzsche. And again, that's exactly why I'm doing the entire series on Nietzsche's masterpiece, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But here the point is that we have an enormously influential precedence in very recent philosophy, namely with Nietzsche, that is telling us, instructing us, that the very careful, meticulous, and thoughtful reading of Thucydides is absolutely not some mere antiquarian activity. In fact, it's quite the opposite. We are being told by a first-rate philosopher that there is a teaching in Thucydides that constitutes not only an alternative to the entire Western philosophical tradition and is so importantly relevant for us that it could cure the problem of the most vulgar nihilism that Nietzsche has diagnosed as our terminal illness. So just think about that. Nietzsche, the teacher of the Overman, and the problem of the meaning of the claim that God is dead, is holding up Thucydides very explicitly to us and saying, this is what helped me to overcome the entire tradition of Platonism. And if you too learn from him, Thucydides, then he can teach you not only also how to overcome the entire tradition of Platonism, but also how to gain the reins of power. And what's most amazing about that is that of all the other people that Nietzsche could have included there, he says Machiavelli's Prince is the only other thing that might come in second place in comparison to Thucydides. But okay, I'll leave it at that with Nietzsche and give a very tentative, brief summary of what I'll spend the next few hours talking about that's available to us precisely through a very careful, meticulous, thoughtful reading of the opening few paragraphs of Thucydides' Peloponnesian War.